The morning sun was bright at Incheon International Airport. Mr. Han Soo stood straight in his dark blue uniform, checking his watch for the 10th time. As the lead flight attendant for Skywings Airlines' first-class cabin, he always arrived 3 hours before any flight. Today was special. Flight SK-447 to Los Angeles would have a very important passenger. Mr. Han called Ms. Kim Ji, running toward him in her neat uniform. She was the most experienced flight attendant on his team. The passenger list just updated. Is it true? Is Mike Tyson really flying with us today? Mr. Han nodded with a small smile. Yes, he is. That's why I called everyone in early. We need to make sure everything is perfect. The first-class cabin crew gathered in their small meeting room. Mr. Lee Min-ho, their newest team member, was already there, organizing the passenger files. His hand shook a little as he handed out the papers. I can't believe we're going to serve Mike Tyson, Mr. Lee said, his eyes wide with excitement. I watched all his fights with my father when I was young. Mr. Han raised his hand for attention. Remember, everyone, Mr. Tyson is a VIP passenger, but he needs to be treated with the same respect we show all our guests. No asking for autographs or photos unless he offers. The crew nodded, but their excited whispers continued as they reviewed the seating arrangements. Mike Tyson was assigned to seat 1A, the best spot in first class with extra legroom and a perfect view. 2 hours before takeoff, passengers began arriving at the gate. Mr. Han watched as his team worked smoothly, checking documents and guiding people to the pre-flight waiting area. Everything was going according to plan until Mrs. Park Yuno walked in. Mrs. Park was well known to the airline staff, but not in a good way. She was the wife of Mr. Park Dae, who owned several luxury hotels in Seoul. She always flew first class and always caused problems. Mr. Han, she called out, her designer handbag swinging on her arm. I need to speak with you immediately. Mr. Han walked over, keeping his professional smile in place. How can I help you today, Mrs. Park? Mrs. Park looked around to make sure others could not hear her. I saw the passenger list. You have seated me in 1B, next to that boxer. She said the last words like they tasted bad in her mouth. Yes, Mrs. Park. Seat 1B is one of our best locations. You'll have excellent service there. Mrs. Park's face turned slightly red. I cannot sit there. I won't feel comfortable sitting next to someone like him. You need to move him to another seat. Mr. Han felt his smile freeze on his face. He had dealt with difficult passengers before, but this was different. I apologize, Mrs. Park, but Mr. Tyson's seat was specially arranged. Perhaps I could move you to another first-class seat. No, Mrs. Park said sharply. I always sit in the front row. My husband specifically requests it. You need to move him. At that moment, Mr. Lee approached them. Mr. Han, Mike Tyson has arrived at the airport. Security is escorting him to our gate now. Mrs. Park's eyes widened. She pulled out her phone and stepped away, speaking rapidly into it. Mr. Han knew she was calling her husband, and that meant trouble was coming. Sure enough, 5 minutes later, his phone rang. It was his supervisor, Ms. Cho Mei. Han Soo, she said, skipping the usual greetings. Mr. Park Dada just called Mr. Kang Tai, our regional manager. They're good friends, you know. Mr. Kang wants you to move Mr. Tyson to another seat. Mrs. Park must have the front row. It's company policy to accommodate our regular VIP customers. Mr. Han felt his stomach turn. Ms. Cho, with all respect, Mike Tyson is also a VIP customer. Moving him without a valid reason would be. This is not a discussion, Mr. Han. Ms. Cho cut him off. Mr. Kang was very clear. Move Mr. Tyson, or you'll be responsible for upsetting one of our most valuable clients. As Mr. Han ended the call, he saw Mike Tyson walking toward the gate. The boxing legend was dressed simply in a black t-shirt and jeans, but he had a presence that made everyone stop and stare. He walked calmly, nodding politely at people who recognized him. Mr. Lee rushed forward to greet him, his training overcoming his excitement. "Welcome to Sky Wings Airlines, Mr. Tyson. I'm Lee Minho, and I'll be one of your flight attendants today." Mike Tyson smiled warmly, shaking Mr. Lee's hand. "Thank you, Mr. Lee. Nice to meet you." Mr. Han watched as Mrs. Park made a show of moving away from the gate area, her face twisted in disgust. He felt sick about what he had to do next. Walking over to Mr. Tyson and Mr. Lee, he took a deep breath. "Mr. Tyson, I apologize, but we need to make a small change to your seating arrangement." Mike Tyson looked at him calmly. "Why is that?" Before Mr. Han could answer, Mrs. Park spoke loudly from several feet away. "Because I refuse to sit next to someone like you." The gate area went completely quiet. Passengers stopped their conversations, turning to stare at the scene. Mr. Lee's face turned pale, and Ms. Kim Ji, who was checking boarding passes, froze in place. Mike Tyson turned slowly to look at Mrs. Park. His face showed no anger, just a deep sadness that made Mr. Han's heart hurt. Then, very calmly, Mike Tyson pulled out his phone. "Excuse me for a moment," he said politely to Mr. Han. "I need to make a call." As Mike Tyson dialed a number, Mrs. Park smiled triumphantly at Mr. Han. She clearly thought she had won. But Mr. Han noticed something strange. Mike Tyson wasn't calling his manager or his lawyer. The number he dialed was very familiar to anyone who worked for Sky Wings Airlines. He was calling their global CEO directly. The atmosphere at the gate crackled with tension as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Mr. Han looked at his watch. There was still an hour before takeoff, but he had a feeling this flight was about to become very different from what anyone had planned. Mrs. Park was still standing there, looking proud and certain that her husband's influence would win the day. But as he watched Mike Tyson speaking quietly into his phone, Mr. Han remembered something his grandmother used to say: "The higher you climb on your pride, the harder you fall when it breaks." He had a feeling Mrs. Park was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The gate area of Incheon International Airport remained quiet as Mike Tyson held his phone to his ear. Even the usual airport announcements seemed softer, as if the whole terminal was holding its breath. "Hello, James," Mike Tyson said into the phone, his voice calm and clear. "Yes, it's Mike. I'm at your Incheon Airport gate right now. We need to talk about something important." Mr. Han Soo watched as Mrs. Park's confident smile began to fade. She clearly hadn't expected Mike Tyson to have the CEO's personal phone number. Mr. Lee Minho stood nearby, clutching his tablet so tightly his knuckles were white. "I see," Mike Tyson continued speaking. "So you're telling me that Sky Wings Airlines has a strict policy against discrimination." He paused, listening. "Would you like to know what just happened at your gate?" Mrs. Park suddenly moved forward, waving her own phone. "My husband is talking to Mr. Kang right now." "This is ridiculous." Her voice was higher than usual, with a note of panic creeping in. Ms. Kim Ji stepped between Mrs. Park and Mike Tyson. "Please lower your voice, Mrs. Park. This is a public area." In his office on the other side of the airport, Mr. Kang Ta was having a very uncomfortable conversation with Mr. Park Da. "Of course, your wife's comfort is our top priority," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I've already ordered the staff tow." His other phone started ringing, the phone that only rang when someone very important was calling. Mr. Kang's face turned pale when he saw the caller ID. Back at the gate, Mike Tyson was still speaking calmly into his phone. "Yes, James. The lady said exactly that. She refuses to sit next to someone like me. Your staff seemed ready to move me to please her." Mr. Han's phone buzzed. It was another message from Ms. Cho Mai. "Do not move anyone. Wait for any new instructions." Mrs. Park's phone rang next. Her husband's voice was shaking as he spoke to her. "Yuna, what have you done? Do you know who Mike Tyson was talking to? Why does it matter?" Mrs. Park snapped, but her voice wasn't as strong as before. "You said Mr. Kang would handle everything." Mr. Kang just got a call from the global CEO, her husband said. The same CEO who apparently plays golf with Mike Tyson every month in Los Angeles. Mrs. Park's face changed color so quickly that Ms. Kim Ji stepped closer, worried she might faint. The designer handbag slipped from her arm, hitting the floor with a soft thud. Mike Tyson was finishing his call. "Thank you, James. Yes, I'll wait right here." He put his phone away and sat down in one of the gate chairs, pulling out a book to read. The next 30 minutes were filled with a flurry of phone calls and rushing airline officials. Mr. Kang Tai arrived at the gate, his usual confident stride replaced by nervous steps. Ms. Cho Mi appeared right behind him, her face showing the stress of someone who knew they had made a terrible mistake. "Mr. Tyson," Mr. Kang said, bowing deeply. "On behalf of Skywings Airlines, I want to personally apologize for this situation." Mike Tyson looked up from his book. "I'm not the one you should be apologizing to," he said quietly. "You should apologize to your staff. They were put in an impossible position because of poor leadership." Mr. Han felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he heard these words. Mr. Lee and Ms. Kim Ji exchanged glances, standing a little straighter. Mrs. Park was still trying to salvage the situation. "Mr. Kang, surely we can work something out. My husband has been a loyal customer for years." "Mrs. Park," Mr. Kang said, his voice trembling slightly. "I've just received direct orders from our global headquarters. Skywings Airlines will no longer be able to provide service to you or your husband." "What?" Mrs. Park's voice rose to a shriek. "You can't do that. Do you know how much money we spend with your airline?" "The decision is final." Ms. Cho Mai stepped in, her own career flashing before her eyes. "Your tickets for today's flight have been refunded. Please leave the gate area." Security officers appeared, standing quietly but firmly nearby. Mrs. Park looked around, searching for any friendly face, but found none. Other passengers were watching with a mixture of satisfaction and embarrassment. "This is outrageous," she declared, grabbing her fallen handbag. "You'll all be sorry when my husband—" "Your husband has already been informed," Mr. Kang interrupted. "He understands the situation." His phone had been buzzing continuously with messages from Mr. Park Dae, who was desperately trying to distance himself from his wife's behavior. As Mrs. Park was escorted away from the gate, Mike Tyson returned to his book. He didn't watch her leave or show any sign of satisfaction. His quiet dignity made her dramatic exit seem even more shameful. Mr. Han gathered his crew for a quick meeting. "Everyone, please return to your duties. We still have a flight to prepare." But before they could move, another group of airline officials arrived at the gate. These were people Mr. Han had only seen in company photographs, executives from the Seoul office. "Mr. Kang Tai and Ms. Cho Mi," one of them said. "Please come with us. We need to discuss today's events in detail." Mr. Kang's face was ashen as he followed them. Ms. Cho Mi looked like she might cry. Everyone knew what "discuss in detail" meant in corporate language. As the gate returned to its normal pre-flight routine, Mr. Lee approached Mike Tyson with a fresh cup of water. "Mr. Tyson, is there anything else you need?" Mike Tyson smiled at the young flight attendant. "No, thank you, Mr. Lee. You're all doing a great job." He paused, then added, "You know, I've faced a lot of opponents in the ring, but the toughest fights are sometimes the ones against prejudice. Those are the ones we can't afford to lose." Mr. Lee nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in those words. As he walked back to help other passengers, he heard people at the gate talking quietly about what had happened. But they weren't gossiping about Mrs. Park's behavior or her husband's influence. Instead, they were discussing how a famous boxer had shown more class and dignity than someone who claimed to be elite. Mr. Han checked his watch again. The flight would board soon, and he knew that by the time they landed in Los Angeles, Skywings Airlines would be a different company. Sometimes it took just one phone call to remind everyone that true respect had nothing to do with money or status. As the first boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, Mike Tyson gathered his things, ready to take his rightful seat in 1A. The story of what happened at Gate 31 would soon spread throughout the airline industry, but for now, there was a flight to Los Angeles to prepare for, and Mr. Han's crew was determined to make it perfect. The events at Gate 31 sent waves through Skywings Airlines corporate offices. In a glass-walled conference room high above Seoul's busy streets, the airline's executives gathered for an emergency meeting. The atmosphere was tense as they watched a video call screen, waiting for their global CEO to appear. Mr. Kang Ta sat at the far end of the table, his usual confidence completely gone. Next to him, Ms. Cho Mi kept adjusting her collar, her hands shaking slightly. They both knew their careers were hanging by a thread. The screen came to life, showing James Wilson, the global CEO of Skywings Airlines. His face was serious as he looked at the gathered executives. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what happened at Incheon Airport today is completely unacceptable. Mike Tyson is not just a valued customer. He is a personal friend and a respected figure in the global sports community." In another office, Mr. Park Dae was dealing with his own crisis. His phone had not stopped ringing since his wife left the airport. Business partners wanted to know what happened. News reporters were asking for comments. His secretary brought him another stack of messages from people canceling their hotel reservations. "How could this happen?" he muttered, looking at a news website. The story was already spreading online. Wealthy businessman's wife demands boxing legend seat, faces immediate consequences. Back at the airport, Flight SK-447 was preparing for boarding. Mr. Han Soo worked with his team, trying to keep everything running smoothly. Mr. Lee Min-ho was helping elderly passengers with their carry-on bags, while Ms. Kim Ji checked boarding passes with her usual efficiency. Mike Tyson sat quietly in his seat, 1A, reading his book. Other first-class passengers who boarded after him were surprisingly respectful, simply nodding politely as they passed. The atmosphere in the cabin was calm but charged with an energy of change. In the corporate conference room, James Wilson continued speaking. "Our airline has always claimed to stand against discrimination. Today, we failed to live up to that promise. Mr. Kang, would you like to explain your actions?" Mr. Kang stood up, his legs unsteady. "Sir, I thought I was protecting our relationship with an important client. The Park family brings significant business to our airline, and that justifies discrimination." James asked sharply. "Tell me, Mr. Kang, how much business do you think we'll lose when people hear that Skywings Airlines values money over human dignity?" The other executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They all understood the serious damage this incident could cause to their company's reputation. At that moment, Mr. Park Dae was writing an official apology statement. His hands moved quickly over his keyboard as he tried to save what remained of his business reputation. "I deeply apologize for my wife's unacceptable behavior at Incheon Airport today. Her actions do not reflect my personal values or the values of our business. We acknowledge our mistake and accept Skywings Airlines' decision to terminate our business relationship." In the first-class cabin, Mr. Lee approached Mike Tyson with a glass of water. "Mr. Tyson, we'll be taking off in about 15 minutes. Is everything comfortable for you?" Mike Tyson looked up with a kind smile. "Everything is perfect. Thank you." "You know, Mr. Lee, sometimes people think strength is about pushing others down, but real strength is about lifting others up." Mr. Lee nodded, understanding the wisdom in those words. As he walked back to help other passengers, his phone buzzed with a company-wide email. All Skywings Airlines employees were receiving new training materials about handling discrimination and protecting customer dignity. In the conference room, James Wilson was making final decisions. "Mr. Kang Ta, Ms. Cho Mi, your employment with Skywings Airlines is terminated, effective immediately. We cannot have leaders who compromise our values for profit." Mr. Kang's face turned pale, but he accepted the decision without argument. Ms. Cho Mi wiped tears from her eyes as she gathered her belongings. They both knew they deserved this outcome. As for the Park family, James continued, "They are permanently banned from all Skywings Airlines flights. We're also canceling our contracts with their hotel chain. This may cost us some money in the short term, but our integrity is worth more than any business deal." The news spread quickly through the airline industry. Other companies began reviewing their own policies about handling VIP customers and discrimination. The incident became a turning point, showing that money and influence couldn't protect people who chose to discriminate. On Flight SK-447, the captain's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Skywings Airlines, Flight SK-447 to Los Angeles. We're honored to have you with us today." Mr. Han watched as his crew prepared for takeoff. The empty seat 1B, where Mrs. Park would have sat, was now occupied by a young student who had been upgraded from economy class. The student couldn't stop smiling at his luck, and Mike Tyson had already started a friendly conversation with him about his studies. In his hotel office, Mr. Park Day received another phone call. This time it was from his board of directors. They wanted an emergency meeting to discuss the future of his position as CEO. His wife's actions had not only cost them their airline privileges, but were now threatening their entire business empire. The Skywings Airlines executives ended their video call with James Wilson, but remained in the conference room to draft new company policies. They wanted to make sure that what happened today would never happen again. From now on, the new policy began. All Skywings Airlines employees are empowered to refuse service to any customer who displays discriminatory behavior, regardless of their status or spending history. As Flight SK-447 lifted off from Incheon International Airport, Mr. Han thought about how one phone call had changed everything. But it wasn't just the call to the CEO that mattered. It was the choice to stand up against discrimination, no matter the cost. The story of what happened at Gate 31 would be told in Skywings Airlines training programs for years to come. It would remind everyone that true respect and dignity couldn't be bought with money or status. Sometimes it took a champion from the boxing ring to teach a lesson about fighting the right battles in life. The news about the incident at Incheon Airport spread faster than anyone expected. By the time Flight SK-447 reached cruising altitude, social media was filled with discussions about what had happened at Gate 31. In the first-class cabin, Mr. Han Soo noticed how different the atmosphere was from his usual flights. Passengers spoke quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing respectfully at Mike Tyson, who continued reading his book peacefully. The empty seats where the Parks usually sat now held a young student and an elderly grandmother who had been upgraded from economy class. Meanwhile, at Skywings Airlines headquarters, the Human Resources Department was working overtime. Mr. Kang Tai and Ms. Cho Mai sat in separate offices, completing their exit paperwork. Security officers waited nearby to escort them from the building. Mr. Kang stared at his computer screen, reading the official termination letter. "Your employment with Skywings Airlines is terminated effective immediately due to failure to uphold company values and demonstrating poor judgment in a discriminatory situation. All company benefits will cease at the end of this month." In another part of Seoul, Mr. Park Dae faced his own problems. He sat in an emergency board meeting at his hotel company, Park Luxury Hotels. The board members looked at him with disappointment as they reviewed the day's events. "Mr. Park," the board chairman said, "your wife's actions have caused significant damage to our reputation. We have already lost 3 major corporate contracts. Skywings Airlines has canceled all their crew accommodation agreements with our hotels." Mr. Park wiped sweat from his forehead. "I understand the severity of the situation. My wife's behavior was unacceptable." "It's more than unacceptable," another board member added. "It's destroying our business. Our stock price has dropped 15% since the news broke." Back on Flight SK-447, Mr. Lee Min-ho served drinks to the first-class passengers. When he reached Mike Tyson's seat, he found the boxing champion having a friendly conversation with the students sitting next to him. "You want to be a sports journalist?" Mike Tyson asked the young man. "That's wonderful. We need more people who can tell stories about athletes as human beings, not just competitors. Mr. Lee smiled as he heard this conversation. It was a perfect example of how wrong Mrs. Park had been about Mike Tyson. The man she had refused to sit next to was showing more kindness and wisdom than she had ever displayed in all her flights with them. In the Skywings Airlines offices, the marketing team worked rapidly to handle the situation. They prepared a public statement that would be released as soon as Flight SK-447 landed in Los Angeles. Skywings Airlines reaffirms our commitment to treating all passengers with dignity and respect. We have zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind. The events at Incheon Airport today resulted in immediate termination of the responsible managers and a permanent ban of the customers who displayed discriminatory behavior. Ms. Kim Ji, walking through the first-class cabin, noticed how many passengers were reading news articles about the incident on their phones. Some were sharing the story on social media, praising Skywings Airlines for taking strong action against discrimination. At Park Luxury Hotels, the board meeting reached its conclusion. Mr. Park, the chairman announced, "We request your temporary step-down from the CEO position while we conduct a full review. Your wife's actions have shown that our company needs to reassess its values and leadership." Mr. Park nodded slowly, accepting his fate. His phone buzzed with another message. His wife's social club had just canceled her membership. Their carefully built social status was crumbling hour by hour. In the Skywings Airlines training department, trainers were already updating their materials. They created a new case study based on today's events, titled Maintaining Dignity: How to Handle Discrimination in Air Travel. The new training manual included clear instructions. When faced with discriminatory requests from any passenger, regardless of their status. 1. Firmly refuse to participate in discriminatory actions. 2. Immediately report the incident to senior management. 3. Protect the dignity of all passengers. 4. Remember that no amount of money justifies discrimination. As Flight SK-447 continued across the Pacific Ocean, Mr. Han received a message from the airline's headquarters. It was a new company-wide policy statement that would take effect immediately. Skywings Airlines celebrates diversity and upholds the dignity of all passengers and employees. We will no longer maintain business relationships with individuals or companies that display discriminatory behavior. Our commitment to equality supersedes any financial considerations. In the first-class galley, Mr. Lee and Ms. Kim Ji discussed the changes happening in their company. "Do you think things will really be different now?" Mr. Lee asked. Ms. Kim Ji nodded confidently. "Yes, I do. What happened today showed everyone that doing the right thing matters more than making money." Meanwhile, Mrs. Park had retreated to her luxury apartment, but she couldn't escape the consequences of her actions. Her phone was filled with messages from former friends distancing themselves from her. Social media was flooded with criticism of her behavior. She turned on her television only to see her story being discussed on news channels. Commentators praised Mike Tyson's dignified response, while criticizing her discriminatory attitude. Her carefully cultivated image of social superiority had been shattered in just a few hours. Back on the flight, Mike Tyson finished his conversation with the student and returned to his book. Mr. Han noticed how the other passengers had witnessed a powerful lesson about character and dignity. The man who had fought brutal battles in the boxing ring had shown them that the greatest strength lies in treating others with respect. In the Skywings Airlines offices, the remaining executives continued working on new policies. They created a special committee for handling VIP passengers, with clear guidelines about maintaining equality and respect for all customers. The company's employee handbook was updated with a new section. At Skywings Airlines, our definition of VIP is based on how people treat others, not on how much money they spend. True class is shown through respect, dignity, and kindness to all. As the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, Flight SK-447 continued its journey to Los Angeles. The events of the day had triggered changes that would affect not just one airline, but the entire industry's approach to customer service and equality. Mr. Han thought about how a single phone call had started it all, but it wasn't really about the call. It was about standing up for what was right, about showing that true respect had to be earned through actions, not bought with money. As he watched his crew work professionally and efficiently, he knew that Skywings Airlines would never be the same. And that was a good thing. As Flight SK-447 began its descent into Los Angeles International Airport, the story of what happened at Gate 31 had already changed many lives. The morning sun painted the sky in bright colors, marking the beginning of a new era for Skywings Airlines. Mr. Han Su stood in the first-class galley, preparing for landing. His phone had been busy with messages from other flight crews around the world, all talking about the changes happening in their company. The news had spread to other airlines too, making everyone think about how they handled similar situations. In the main cabin, Mr. Lee Min-ho helped passengers prepare for landing. He noticed how different everyone acted now. There was a new kind of respect in the air, not based on money or status, but on how people treated each other. Mike Tyson closed his book and looked out the window at the California coastline. Next to him, the young student who had been upgraded to first class was still amazed by his luck. Not just because he got to fly in first class, but because he had spent hours talking with someone he had only seen on television before. "Remember what I told you about journalism?" Mike Tyson said to the student. "The best stories are about the moments when people choose to do what's right, even when it's not easy." Back in Seoul, the Skywings Airlines Training Center was already using the day's events to teach new employees. The instructor stood before a class of flight attendants, sharing the story that would become a crucial part of their company's history. "Today, we're going to learn about a turning point in our airline's history," the instructor began. It started with a simple question. What makes someone truly important? Is it their money, their status, or how they treat others? In another part of Seoul, Mr. Park Dae sat in his home office, writing resignation letters to various business organizations. His wife's actions had cost them more than just airline privileges. Their social and business world had changed completely in just one day. Mrs. Park, who had once proudly shown off her airline status card at social events, now faced a different kind of attention. Her friends avoided her calls, and her social media accounts were filled with criticism. She learned the hard way that real respect couldn't be bought with money or claimed through status. As Flight SK-447 touched down in Los Angeles, Mr. Han gathered his crew for a final briefing. "Thank you all for handling today's situation with professionalism and dignity," he said. "We've been part of an important change in our company's history." Ms. Kim Ji nodded in agreement. "I received a message from our new training department. They want us to help create guidelines for handling similar situations in the future." The passengers began to leave the aircraft, many of them stopping to thank the crew not just for the service, but for standing up for what was right. When Mike Tyson stood up to leave, he shook hands with each crew member. "You know," he said to Mr. Han, "in my career I learned that the biggest victories often come from the fights we choose not to have. Today, you all won an important fight by staying calm and professional." Meanwhile, at Skywings Airlines headquarters, the changes continued. The new management team, which replaced Mr. Kang Tai and Ms. Cho Mei, introduced a special recognition program. They would honor employees who showed exceptional courage in standing up against discrimination. The first recipients of this award would be Mr. Han Su and his crew. The award citation read, "For demonstrating that true service means treating all passengers with equal dignity and respect, regardless of their status or influence." In the Los Angeles terminal, reporters waited to talk to Mike Tyson about what had happened. But instead of just telling his story, he talked about the airline crew who handled the situation with grace and professionalism. "The real heroes today were the airline staff," he told the reporters. "They showed that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand up for what's right, even when powerful people want you to do something wrong." The story spread quickly across social media and news channels. Other airlines began reviewing their own policies about VIP passengers and discrimination. The incident became a case study in business schools, teaching future managers about the importance of ethical leadership. 1 month later, Skywings Airlines held a special ceremony. They introduced their new company values, written in large letters in their headquarters lobby. Every passenger deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. True VIP status comes from how you treat others, not from how much you spend. Mr. Lee Min-ho, now promoted to senior flight attendant, stood with his colleagues as they received their special recognition awards. He thought about how much had changed since that day at Gate 31. The young student who had sat next to Mike Tyson wrote his first published article about the experience. It appeared in a major sports magazine, telling the story of how a boxing champion taught him that real strength shows itself in how we treat others. Mrs. Park eventually wrote a public apology, acknowledging her mistakes and promising to learn from them. Her letter became part of Skywings Airlines training materials, showing how prejudice and discrimination could harm both individuals and businesses. As for Mike Tyson, he continued to fly with Skywings Airlines. But now, whenever he boarded a flight, crew members didn't just see him as a famous boxer or a VIP passenger. They saw him as someone who helped their company become better by standing up for what was right. The story of Flight SK-447 became more than just a tale about one incident at an airport gate. It became a lesson about dignity, respect, and the true meaning of status. It showed that sometimes the most important victories happen not in a boxing ring, but in the everyday moments when people choose to do what's right. Mr. Han kept the letter of commendation he received framed on his wall. But more important than the recognition was the knowledge that he and his crew had been part of a change that made their company, and perhaps the whole airline industry, a little bit better. As new crews trained at Skywings Airlines, they all learned about what happened that day at Gate 31. They learned that true service meant treating everyone with dignity, that real respect had to be earned through actions, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do was stand up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. The story of Mike Tyson and Flight SK-447 became a reminder that in life, as in boxing, the biggest victories often come from standing up for what you believe in, treating others with respect, and remembering that true character shows itself not in how we treat the powerful, but in how we treat everyone.